The dregs of lukewarm coffee coated Chloe's tongue, a bitter match for the exhaustion settling deep in her bones. 12 hours on her feet. 12 hours of beeping machines, the cloying smell of antiseptic, and the endless, draining need of strangers. All she wanted was 20 minutes of greasy spoon anonymity before the second part of her day began, picking up her son, Leo, and being a mother. The diner was a study in worn vinyl and flickering fluorescent lights. She sat in a booth by the window, watching rain streak the glass. Her light blue scrubs felt like a second skin, a uniform that defined her.
Nurse. Caretaker.
The one who fixed things. That's when she noticed him. He wasn't noticeable in a loud way. In fact, his defining characteristic was his stillness. He was in a wheelchair, parked at a small table meant for two. A suit of exquisite cut, dark as a starless night, draped a frame that was lean and tense. It was the kind of suit that belonged in a boardroom overlooking the city, not a diner that smelled of fried onions. His hands rested on the wheels of his chair, long-fingered and elegant, a stark contrast to the chipped Formica tabletop. He ate his meal with a quiet, deliberate precision, his focus absolute. He moved like the room owed him space, and the shabby little diner seemed to bend to his will, the usual clatter and chatter dimming in his immediate vicinity. Chloe found herself watching him, a professional curiosity at first. She assessed the line of his shoulders, the way he held his neck. He was paralyzed from the waist down, she guessed. An old injury, judging by the lack of atrophy in his upper body. He was strong. And he was alone. The disruption, when it came, was as jarring as a code blue. Two college-age boys swaggered in, shaking rain from their Letterman jackets. They were loud, entitled, reeking of cheap beer and arrogance. They took the booth behind the man in the wheelchair, and the sneering began almost immediately. It was quiet at first, a murmur she almost missed. "Check out Mr. Fancy Pants," a snicker. "All dressed up and nowhere to walk." Chloe's jaw tightened. She'd heard 1,000 variations of that casual cruelty. On the bus, in the emergency room, in the grocery store line. It was the casual, unthinking malice of people who had never known a day of real struggle. The diner staff, a harried waitress and a cook visible through the pass-through, pointedly ignored them. The boys grew bolder. "Hey, buddy, lose your legs in a pimp-off," one of them called out, his voice carrying across the diner. "Or, did you just forget how to use them?" The man in the wheelchair did not react. He continued to eat, his movements economical and smooth. He didn't even lift his eyes from his plate. His silence seemed to infuriate them, to egg them on. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Or is that just how you people are? All quiet and sneaky?" Chloe's fork clattered onto her plate.
Enough.
Her entire body was a thrumming wire of indignation. She was a single mother working double shifts to keep a roof over her son's head. She was tired of being tired, and she was done letting bullies win. She slid out of her booth. The worn soles of her sneakers made no sound on the linoleum. She walked over to their table, stopping beside it and planting her hands on her hips. Her voice, when she spoke, was the same low, no-nonsense tone she used to manage delirious patients in the ICU. "Is there a problem here?" The two boys looked up startled. Their eyes flickered over her scrubs, her brown skin, her unimpressed expression. They dismissed her instantly. "Mind your own business, lady," the first one sneered. "He's my business," Chloe lied smoothly. "I'm his private nurse. And you two are agitating him, which could cause a spike in his blood pressure and autonomic dysreflexia. Given his level of injury, that could trigger a stroke. Do you want to be responsible for that?" They blinked, their bravado faltering in the face of her clinical terminology. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't emotional. She was stating medical facts with the chilling authority of someone who had seen death up close. "His injury is at the thoracic level," she continued, her gaze hard. "That means the nerve signals from his lower body are scrambled. A stressor, like, for instance, two ignorant children making fun of his disability, can cause a potentially fatal hypertensive crisis. So I'm going to ask you one more time. Is there a problem here?" She let the silence stretch, the medical threat hanging in the air. They looked at each other, then at the silent man in the wheelchair, then back at her. They were used to shouting matches, to emotional reactions. They didn't know what to do with this calm, controlled woman in scrubs who looked at them like they were a particularly unpleasant diagnosis. "Whatever," the second one mumbled, shoving his friend. "Let's go." They scrambled out of the booth and practically fled the diner, casting one last resentful glance over their shoulders. Chloe let out a slow breath, the tension leaving her in a rush. She turned to the man in the wheelchair, a polite, professional smile ready on her lips. "I'm sorry you had to deal with that." The smile died before it formed. He had finally looked up. His eyes were dark, almost black, and utterly unreadable. There was no gratitude in them. No relief. There was only assessment. Cold, sharp, and deeply unsettling. He looked at her not like a savior, but like a new, unexpected variable in a complex equation. Then he spoke, and his voice was a low rumble, devoid of any discernible accent, each word carved from ice. "You have a name?" "Chloe," she said, her throat suddenly dry. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Chloe, you just made two very insignificant but very loud enemies. You also made a very significant one." And he paused, his gaze pinning her in place. "Me." A chill went down her spine that had nothing to do with the draft from the door. Before she could process his words, he gave a subtle, almost imperceptible flick of his fingers. A man she hadn't even registered, who had been sitting in a corner booth nursing a glass of water, rose silently and approached their table. He was built like a refrigerator, dressed in a simple, dark suit that suddenly looked like a uniform. Min-jun, the man in the wheelchair, gestured toward her. "See her home. Make sure she's safe." It wasn't a request. It was an order delivered with the absolute certainty of a man who had never had one refused. "That's not necessary," Chloe stammered, her mind reeling. "I have to go. I have to pick up my son. Your destination is irrelevant," Min-jun said, his eyes still locked on hers.
He will take you there.
"And he'll ensure you arrive. You inserted yourself into my business. Now you are my business." He turned his attention back to his meal, as if she no longer existed. The conversation was over. Chloe felt the floor drop out from beneath her. She was trapped. The black sedan waiting outside was so polished it reflected the dreary streetlights like distorted stars. The large, silent man, his name, she learned, was Kwan, held the rear door open for her. It felt less like a courtesy and more like an induction. "I can take the bus," she insisted, her voice tight with a rising panic. "My mother's house is just a few blocks from the stop." Kwan's expression remained impassive, his eyes hidden behind dark glasses despite the night. "The boss's orders," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Defeated, she slid onto the plush leather seat. The door closed with a heavy, final-sounding thud, sealing her inside a world of quiet luxury and palpable menace. This was no longer a simple diner incident. This was something else entirely. She drove to her mother's, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, acutely aware of Kwan's silent presence in the driver's seat. He waited, engine idling, while she ran in to scoop a sleepy Leo into her arms, murmuring reassurances to her mother she didn't feel herself. Kwan followed her modest sedan back to her apartment complex. He didn't leave. The black car parked across the street, a silent, unblinking sentinel. For the next 3 days, it was always there. A different car sometimes, a different driver, but always there. She was being watched. Her small, manageable world had shrunk to the size of a cage. On the 4th day, he came to her. The knock on her apartment door was firm, authoritative. When she opened it, Min-jun was there, flanked by Kwan and another man just as imposing. He rolled his wheelchair over the threshold, his presence immediately dominating her small living room. The space, usually filled with Leo's toys and the comfortable scent of her life, suddenly felt cramped and fragile. "I have a proposition for you," he said, without preamble. He surveyed her apartment, his gaze lingering on a crayon drawing of a lopsided sun taped to the wall. I require a private nurse. Someone discreet.
Competent.
You have proven you are competent. Chloe stared at him, incredulous. No, she said, the word coming out sharper than she intended. Absolutely not. I have a job. I have a life. I want nothing to do with whatever this is. He was unfazed. The two boys from the diner. Their fathers are city councilmen. They filed a formal complaint against you at your hospital. Harassment, they called it. Unprofessional conduct. Ice flooded her veins.
Her job.
Her license. It will be dismissed, he continued, his voice maddeningly calm. I have already seen to it, but other problems can be arranged. A failed health inspection at your son's daycare. An unexpected rent increase. Small things at first, then larger. Your life can become very difficult, Chloe. Or it can become very simple. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact, a demonstration of his reach. He was the storm, and he was the shelter. Before she could form a reply, a small voice piped up.
Nana.
Leo stood in the hallway, rubbing sleep from his eyes, his favorite stuffed dinosaur clutched in one hand. His curious gaze fell on Minjun. Instead of fear, his face lit up with childish fascination. He walked right up to the wheelchair. Why are you in a chair? Leo asked, with the unfiltered honesty only a 5-year-old possesses. The two guards tensed. Chloe held her breath, her protective instincts screaming. But Minjun didn't get angry. He looked down at her son, and for a fleeting, unguarded moment, his mask of cold control slipped. A shadow of profound, ancient pain flickered in his dark eyes. It was there and gone in a heartbeat, but she saw it. I was in an accident, Minjun said, and his voice was different.
Softer.
Stripped of its icy authority. Someone I was supposed to protect. I couldn't. There it was. The wound. The crack in the armor. It was tied to a failure, to a woman he had lost. The wheelchair wasn't just a disability. It was a monument to his powerlessness in one crucial moment. He looked from Leo back to Chloe, his expression shifting. He's brave, he said. It was a simple observation, but it landed like a concession. He wasn't just seeing an asset or a problem anymore. He was seeing her as a mother. He renewed his offer, his voice regaining some of its steel, but tempered now with something else. Your salary will be 5 times what the hospital pays. You will have a private suite in my home. Your son will be safe there. Safer than he is here. His gaze swept the room again, taking in the second-hand furniture, the faint water stain on the ceiling. He was offering her a gilded cage, but one that promised a security she fought for every single day and still fell short of. She thought of the complaint at the hospital, now magically gone. She thought of the car outside, a symbol of both threat and protection. Most of all, she thought of Leo's innocent, trusting face. The world was dangerous. She knew that. And this man, Minjun, was the most dangerous thing she had ever encountered. But he was also offering her son a shield she could not provide on her own. I'll do it, she heard herself say. The decision settled in her stomach like a stone. It was a choice made under duress, but it was a choice nonetheless. She was choosing to walk into the lion's den to keep her cub safe. As Kwon began to quietly coordinate the logistics of her move, Minjun gestured for her to approach. My arm, he said, his voice low. The dressing needs to be changed. He had a bandage on his forearm, a small, neat square of white gauze. She knelt beside his chair, her training taking over, pushing aside the tremor in her hands. She unwrapped the bandage to reveal a clean, shallow cut, already healing. Her fingers were gentle, efficient as she cleaned the wound and applied a fresh dressing. They were so close. The air was thick with the scent of him, an expensive, clean fragrance of cedarwood and something cold, like winter air. He smelled like power. She worked in silence, her focus narrowed to the task, to the feel of his skin beneath her fingertips. When she finished, she made the mistake of looking up. He was already watching her. His dark gaze was intense, possessive, and stripped of all pretense. It was the look of a predator that had finally cornered its prey, only to find it was something far more interesting than he had anticipated. The space between them crackled with a tension that had nothing to do with his injury and everything to do with the silent, charged current passing between them. That was the moment everything changed. She told herself it was survival instinct. She was lying to herself. Life in Min Jun's penthouse was like living inside a diamond. Perched high above the city, it was a fortress of glass, steel, and silence. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a god's-eye view of the world below, a world that no longer felt like hers. Chloe and Leo had their own suite, larger and more luxurious than any apartment she could ever dream of affording. Her days fell into a new, surreal rhythm. She managed Min Jun's physical therapy, his pain medication, and the meticulous care his condition required. She also learned to see without looking, to listen without hearing. Men in dark, tailored suits moved through the penthouse like ghosts, their conversations low and urgent. She pieced together the truth from overheard whispers and discarded documents left carelessly on a table. Min Jun wasn't just a wealthy, disabled man. He was the head of the Golden Viper clan, a Korean syndicate that held a significant portion of the city's underworld in its iron grip. The knowledge should have sent her running. It should have terrified her. But instead, a strange, grim acceptance settled in. She was already in the dragon's lair. Learning its name didn't change the fire. The danger became real on a rainy Tuesday. They were in his armored town car, returning from a specialist appointment, when the world exploded. A heavy truck rammed them, the screech of metal on metal a deafening scream. The car spun, windows cracking but not shattering. Before it even stopped moving, gunfire erupted, peppering the bulletproof glass. Kwon, in the front seat, was already returning fire, his movements precise and lethal. But there were too many of them. One of the attackers smashed the driver's side window with a sledgehammer and lunged inside. He had a gun, and it was pointed directly at Min Jun, who was trapped, a king on a broken throne. Time seemed to slow. Chloe saw the man's finger tightening on the trigger.
She didn't think.
She acted. She grabbed the heavy medical bag at her feet, filled with oxygen tanks, diagnostic tools, and first aid supplies, and swung it with every ounce of strength she had. The bag connected with the gunman's head with a sickening thud. He staggered back, dazed for just a second. It was the only second Kwon needed. The threat was neutralized. The aftermath was a blur of shouting, blood, and the smell of cordite. Min Jun looked at her, his face pale. It wasn't fear she saw in his eyes. It was a raw, stark realization of how close she and Leo had come to being casualties in his war. Back in the penthouse, they had one of the attackers alive. He was tied to a chair in the cavernous study, bleeding from a leg wound, defiant. He wouldn't talk. Min Jun's lieutenants were preparing to escalate, their methods medieval and effective. The man would die before he gave them what they needed. "Stop," Chloe said, her voice cutting through the tense silence. All eyes turned to her. "You're doing it wrong. He'll bleed out. Let me." She walked toward the captured man, her face a mask of cold professionalism. She knelt beside him, ignoring the blood. She didn't reach for a bandage. Instead, she pressed 2 fingers into a nerve cluster high on his inner thigh, just beside the wound. An electric shock of pure agony shot through him, and he screamed. "That's your femoral artery," she said, her voice clinically detached, as if delivering a lecture. "You're bleeding out. I can apply pressure and save your life. Or I can let go. You have about 3 minutes to decide which you'd prefer. Tell them what they want to know." She had crossed a line. She knew it. She had weaponized her gift for healing, turning it into an instrument of precise torture. The man, sputtering through the pain, began to talk. Min Jun watched her from his wheelchair, his expression dark and utterly unreadable. He had seen her competence. He had seen her courage. Now he had seen her capacity for ruthlessness. The information they extracted was chilling. The rival faction, the Black Turtles, knew about her. They knew about Leo. They had identified her as Min Jun's weakness. The next attack wouldn't be a brute force ambush on him. It would be surgical. It would be aimed at her. Later that night, unable to sleep, Chloe stood on the vast balcony. The city lights a cold, indifferent constellation below. The adrenaline had long since faded, leaving her feeling hollowed out and shaky. The quiet whir of his wheelchair on the marble floor announced his arrival. He rolled to a stop beside her, the two of them staring out into the darkness. "You should have run," he said finally. It wasn't an accusation. It was a quiet statement of regret. "I couldn't," she whispered.
Lie.
"It wasn't just for your son." He cut her off, his voice a low rasp. He turned to face her, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch, stripping away all her defenses. "You saw what I am today. You saw what this world does to people. And you stayed.
You saved me.
Then you did what was necessary." He reached out, his hand covering hers where it rested on the cold steel of the railing. His touch was warm, solid, an anchor in the dizzying vertigo of her new reality. "I told myself that keeping you here was a tactical decision," he confessed, his voice barely audible over the distant city hum. "A way to control a variable." That was a lie. He looked at her, his eyes full of a dangerous, unfamiliar emotion. "You are a complication I can no longer afford to be logical about." It wasn't a declaration of love. It was something far more potent. It was an admission of a fatal weakness, a confession that in his world of cold calculation, she had become the one thing he couldn't solve for. And it was the most honest thing anyone had ever said to her. The Black Turtle's plan was as cowardly as it was predictable. They would snatch Leo. Min Jun's intelligence network confirmed it. They had been watching the private, heavily guarded park where Leo played each afternoon. They saw a child and a bodyguard. They saw a soft target. Min Jun's immediate response was to lock the penthouse down, to turn their glass fortress into an impenetrable bunker. But that was a defensive posture, and Min Jun never defended. He attacked. He planned to set a trap, using the park and his men, to annihilate the Black Turtle's leadership. But the plan involved using Leo as the bait. It was a tactical, logical, and utterly monstrous idea. "No," Chloe said, the word a flat, absolute denial. They were in his study, the city's glittering panorama spread out behind him. His lieutenants stood like stone statues around the room. "You will not use my son as a pawn in your game." "It is the surest way," Min Jun countered, his voice tight with frustration. "He will be perfectly safe." "There is no perfectly safe when bullets are flying," she shot back, her fear for Leo overriding any intimidation she felt. "You think like a general moving pieces on a board. I am a mother."
He is not a piece.
"There's a better way." She strode to the large digital map of the area displayed on the wall. "Your rivals are arrogant. They're watching the main entrance to the park here. And the playground. But they're not watching the service gate for the botanical gardens next door. They see it as irrelevant." She turned to face him, her eyes blazing. "You want bait? I'll be the bait. I'll take a stroller from the storage room. I'll put a blanket in it. From their vantage point, they'll see a woman with a child.
Me.
They think I'm your weakness. They'll come for me. They'll divert their resources to grab me, thinking the prize is in the stroller. While they're focused on the decoy, your main force can move in, and another team can have Leo safely away." It was her plan, her risk. She was not a damsel to be rescued. She was a queen moving to protect her own. Min Jun's control finally fractured. "Absolutely not," he snarled, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. "I will not allow you to put yourself in that danger." "My plan is better than yours," she said, her voice unwavering. "It has a higher probability of success, with a lower risk to noncombatants. Namely, my son. Your men are good, but they're not infallible. This way, we control the enemy's focus. Tactically, it's the superior move. You know it is." He stared at her, a war raging in his eyes between the cold-blooded strategist and the man who saw her as a fatal complication. The strategist won. "Agreed," he ground out, the word tasting like ash. The park was cool and damp, the air smelling of wet earth. Chloe's heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were steady on the handle of the empty stroller. She walked a predetermined path, her every move a piece of choreography. She could feel the eyes on her, the predatory focus of the black turtle's spotters. They took the bait. For men converged on her near a thicket of rhododendrons. They moved fast, expecting a terrified, screaming woman. They didn't expect the silent, brutal efficiency of Min Jun's men emerging from the landscape itself. The fight was a whirlwind of violence, swift and shockingly quiet. One attacker broke through the cordon, his face a mask of rage, as he lunged for Chloe. She didn't scream. She didn't freeze. She pulled the canister of pepper spray from her pocket, an addition to the plan she had insisted upon, and fired a stream directly into his eyes. He howled, clawing at his face, and was immediately taken down. The leader of the Black Turtles made a desperate, final stand. He found himself face to face with Min Jun, who had been positioned nearby, seemingly vulnerable in his wheelchair. The man saw a cripple. He was wrong. With a movement too fast to follow, Min Jun brandished a blade that had been concealed in the armrest of his chair. It was over in a single, silent, lethal motion. In the quiet aftermath, as sirens wailed in the distance, Chloe saw the cost. One of Min Jun's men, a young man who had once shyly shown her a picture of his daughter, lay motionless on the grass. Victory was never clean. It was always paid for in blood. Back in the penthouse, the silence was different. The tension was gone, replaced by a heavy, settled peace. Leo was asleep in his bed, safe. Min Jun wheeled himself over to where Chloe stood by the window. He didn't speak for a long time. "My father taught me that in our world, there are only two kinds of people," he said at last, his voice low and resonant. "Assets and liabilities. There is nothing in between." He paused, turning his chair to face her fully. His dark eyes, so often cold and calculating, held a new, undeniable warmth. He was wrong. He looked at her, and in his gaze she saw the entirety of his violent, lonely world. "You are not my nurse, Chloe. You are not my protector. You are my territory.
My home.
And anyone who ever dares to touch you again will find my entire empire burning down around them." It was not a poem. It was not a soft declaration. It was a vow forged in steel and sealed in blood. It was the most absolute claim a man like him could make.
He didn't ask her to stay.
He didn't have to. The choice had been made days ago, in a sterile study as she weaponized her knowledge to save him. It had been made in a sun-dappled park where she offered herself as a sacrifice to protect their future. He held out his hand. She crossed the space between them and knelt beside his chair. It was not an act of submission. It was an act of alliance. She took his hand, her fingers lacing through his, her touch steady and sure. The quiet, desperate life she had known was gone forever, traded for a gilded cage that had become a kingdom. She had chosen this dangerous, broken king, and in his eyes, she saw that he believed she was the only thing that could ever make him whole. The city lights glittered below, and for the first time, they looked like a promise.